Alrighty, welcome to the webinar. My name is Henning Pisunka. It is with great pleasure today that in representation of INSEAD Lifelong Learning, we are welcoming Markus Reitzig today. Markus, if you're there, it would be fantastic if you could join us.
Hey, Henning, good to see you.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Good to see you. Let me start out with a short introduction. As I've kind of put into my LinkedIn post, Markus is the boss when it comes to organizational design. But beyond this kind of playful description of him, Markus is, or actually holds, the endowed chair of strategic management at the University of Vienna. He has also led the strategy area at the University of Vienna since 2012. He has a PhD from the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. He has served as a faculty member at the Copenhagen Business School, at London Business School. He has been a visiting faculty at INSEAD. He also was a visiting student a long time ago at the University of Berkeley. Markus is an outstanding scholar in the field of organizational design and strategy. He has published some of the seminal articles. For example, one of my favorite articles is the paper in the Academy of Management review about what is really new about new forms of organization. One thing I would like to highlight about Markus, because all these other accolades, he is absolutely fantastic in developing young scholars. His doctoral students have gone to amazing places, for example, Duke University, Purdue University, and so on. So he's done an absolutely amazing job, not only with respect to his own work, but also with respect to developing other people's work. So it's a great honor. We are very excited about having Markus here with us today. Markus, thank you so much for joining. The book, it's been a great pleasure. I got a real copy of the book, but I forgot it at home, and Markus was so kind to send me a PDF in the short term. So this is the book. I've killed a bunch of trees for this. But nevertheless, the book has done great good. So this is not a self-help book, okay? Lots of management books are self-help books. This is a book which really kind of helps you to improve your organizations. And in many ways, I would say in that sense, it's much more effective than a self-help book, because whether you and your organization are successful will actually have an enormous impact on you. What Markus takes on a very, very complex issue. He actually asked the question, how can we make organizations more innovative? How can we make them more efficient? How can we improve the time to market? And the key aspect he's focusing on has often been associated with the word a flatter organization. The book is great. I enjoyed reading the book a lot. I've read it a long time, like I read the book when it came out, and had a great time and learned a ton. And I read it again in preparation for the webinar today. The book is very, very rich. You actually learn about management, you learn about organizational structure, but you also learn about human psychology, you learn about sociology, because you see, like as Kurt Vonnegut puts, it's the people, the goddamn people, right? So these organizations need to work for people, and Markus really makes a great effort to look at how do these organizational structures actually work for people. It's not a cookie cutter book. He really kind of makes sure that you understand the complexity of the matter, but then can actually become a very skillful navigator of this. I enjoyed the examples a lot in the book. The writing of the book, it's great. It's really elegantly written. I took like a particular color sometimes just to highlight kind of certain paragraphs or sentences I liked, where I said like, oh, look, this is beautifully written. Without further ado, Markus, why this book now? You're not the first person who kind of wrote about organizational structure. You're not going to be the last, but this book seems to take like a particular spot, and I enjoyed it a lot. What made you write this book? What motivated it? What's its role?
So first of all, Henning, before I answer to your question, I know that you tend to humble people, in introductions. You managed to do so again. Thanks very much for the very kind words. Also for the compliments that you paid to my copy editor, who's obviously in part responsible for writing. No, I think you're posing a very fair question, right? Why another book? And I think on this topic, and the answer is twofold, right? I mean, obviously you could say, if the only thing that you cared about was category leadership on a phenomenon which is very much en vogue these days, coming out with a book and having a catchy title would suffice. Obviously, this is not what we do as scholars. So let me ask you from one scholar to another the following question, right? How many books do you know that deal with organizational design that don't take a macro approach, where eventually somebody tries to sell you a matrix, a divisional or a functional organization, but instead take a micro approach where they familiarize yourself with the needs to divide labor, integrate effort, design communication channels, think about the kinds of nodes where people hold authority and so forth. I'm not sure how many you can think of. I can think of a few. but they're usually difficult to digest for practitioners, right? So that's number one. So if I took those books and then I asked myself, how many of those take seriously the notion that humans show other types of behavior than opportunism, which is something that obviously our friends from organizational econ have dealt with for decades, the number goes down even further, right? 2, 3 perhaps. And if I then ask you how many of those books that remain would actually take very seriously the notion that people very much differ in their preferences, people very much differ in their abilities, and it takes, that we need to embrace that heterogeneity to come up with designs that work. I ended up with an empty set, and that was the justification for me that there would not only be demand, but maybe there's something to supply, because there's so much great work that's been done by lots of people, probably also here in the room, which I will mention whenever I get a chance. Obviously, also by you yourself, by your co-authors Linus, Shona Mahoney, so many people who haven't taken the time to write a book yet. So I thought I'd just take on the burden and I do it.
Wonderful. I think it's a great service to the field of academics. It's also a great field to practitioners. One thing I want to say, I'm going to put this in the chat for everyone. I don't want to distract you, but there's a fantastic website which actually accompanies the book. It's called betterflatter.com. I put it in the chat so you can see there. Otherwise, I would like to encourage, we already have like more than 250 people on the call. So please feel free to also put your questions in the chat. I will come to these later on. Special thanks to Guillaume Kaiser, who has already kind of posted the link to the article, to the AMR that I mentioned. So thank you so much, Guillaume. And otherwise, please kind of feel free to answer your questions. To put your questions in. Markus, the book is Get Better at Flatter. What's a flat organization to begin with?
Very fair question. So I think, sticking true to the terminology that's been used, what we would usually understand under a flat structure would be an organization that's completely decentralized in terms of decision rights and has a maximum density network where everyone can talk to one another. So if this sounds too academic, very simple, this is what you think of a mega team, right? Everyone is allowed to talk to everyone and no one has superior rights. And that this is prone to fail in most organizations which are of significant size is obvious to anyone who's ever worked in an organization, perhaps not so obvious to people who would love to see this kind of vision materialize. And that's why we chose carefully the comparative flatter instead of flat. The goal is not to create flat organizations. That, I believe, is reserved to very few instances where certain boundary conditions come together, but to design organizations which depart from the traditional hierarchical setup where you find the exact opposite, right? Where decision rights are in the hands of very few, if not only one person, where information is being structured so that if there's a high information asymmetry, very few people know a lot of people know very little, and move from that end of the spectrum towards the other end of the spectrum, but not overshooting the mark, which I think is the important. So it is literally that notion of flatter and being a little bit smarter at it than we would be if we didn't pay attention to all the great research that's been done.
I like the combination that a bit of flat organization might also end up, and you very much allude to this, be a little bit of a smart organization. Markus, what does this actually mean? Like we take out a level of the hierarchy, or like try to put this into me in like very specific terms. We have no middle management. What does that mean? Or less middle management?
Yeah. So let's perhaps take just a second. Or not, that's wrong, a minute to reflect on what a hierarchy really means, right? And this is where many of the misconceptions start. And I think this is where we can add some value, and hopefully this is also interesting to the audience here. So a hierarchy is essentially sort of a set of stacked decision makers, which has the notion of being transitive. When I can give an order to you and you can give an order to your subordinate, I can also give an order to your subordinate. So it's transitive. It's asymmetric because I have more power than you, you have more power than your subordinate, right? And it's acyclical. That means it doesn't start from the bottom, sort of once we get there. And that type of a hierarchical structure, I think, has very particular features, right? These very particular features usually come with, what I make asymmetric, right? Is it just power? Is it information flow and so forth? And what we have seen in the past basically are hierarchies that confound all these different things with one another, right? So essentially decision makers at the top would also be the most knowledgeable people in the organization and so forth. And I think this is exactly where we need to stop thinking about hierarchies in that very traditional way and need to ask ourselves, is there a smarter way in which we can set up these informational and incentivization structures. Probably that was only a part to your question, so I'll happily elaborate if you tell me in detail what it is that you would like to know on top.
Markus, what's the promise of making flatter, right? You see, like then when we think about how to say, I often like to think about the epistemology of like scientific fields, and very often before we have a good understanding of the independent variable, we want to understand the dependent variable, right? Like, so what's the advantage of going flatter? You see, like, okay, yeah, flatter. Why should I actually do this? What are kind of the benefits associated with going flatter, or the potential benefits, I should say?
No, I think this is a fantastic question that you raised, which I think is important for everybody to appreciate. I don't think that flattening an organization is a self-purpose, no matter whether it comes in the form of delayering or whether it comes in the form of granting more autonomy to people and widening the span of control without firing middle managers. Literally, I think the idea as to why people think that they need to play around with a degree of centralization, because that is what it is, right, is because they think that this makes them more agile, more democratic, faster, what have you. And there's something to be said for this. And why? Why is there something to be said for this? Well, obviously, there's time that is spent in terms of vertical information flow within the company, right? The CEO communicating to the bottom needs less time if he or she needs to go through fewer layers, vice versa. If the bottom wants to communicate something to the top, there's fewer layers, things can work faster. So there's a point to be made for speed, and under certain conditions, these flatter organizations can outcompete traditional structures in terms of speed, meaning traditional structure, one that has the same amount of people inside the organization, but fewer layers of authority in between. There's something to be said for creativity, of course, right? Because if you flatten an organization, that means you increase the span of control, people become more autonomous, you will probably have team agents in there who need to talk to one another. We know that very often when it comes to creativity inside the organization needs to draw from knowledge which is not located at the top, but which is located everywhere in the organization. So you create these pockets with more horizontal information exchange, which has the potential to potentially come up with better solutions. So under certain boundary conditions, yes, flatter structures may, as a matter of fact, be more prone to producing innovative outcomes than others. So that's true. And then finally, we know that there's, of course, this whole narrative around, people wanting their voice to be heard, particularly when we're talking about Generation Z. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings, but this is what, certainly these people articulate. So offering them an organizational environment in which they can credibly believe that their voice is heard faster than in other setups might also be helpful to attract and potentially retain talent. So those are, I think, three goals which you may want to achieve by playing around with, as you said correctly, the independent variable structure. And why is the independent variable structure so important? Because it is obviously one that every manager at some point in their life, right, will start to play around with, because it is so much easier adjusted than changing the hiring policy, exchanging your workforce overnight, exchanging your managers overnight. So what you're going to do is you're trying to change the way in which people are allowed to make decisions and in which they communicate with one another. So because this is such a powerful independent variable, and because the goals seem so, aspirable, put it this way, that's why almost every manager will find him or herself in a situation where they eventually play around with that.
It's interesting, right? You see, like one thing about, you can avoid certain kind of topics in your life, like as a manager, I feel, but structure is something we are all getting exposed to, right? Whether I like it or not. So I better kind of, like in a certain way, like for me, it's almost like everybody at this point knows that you need to understand software to a certain degree, right? Because whether you like it or not, whether you're interested or not, it'll affect your life. And organizational structure is something which is not necessarily on top of people's mind, but it will affect your life, whether you like it or not. Markus, on this idea of a flat structure, are there like famous organizations? You refer to a bunch of cases, and I want to say I really like the cases in the book. Can you name like a few famous organizations where you would say like these are flat organizations which work? Like I just want to kind of, hey, coming from the abstract definition to like how can I imagine that?
So I would actually like to do the opposite if I'm allowed to, right?
Wonderful.
Because I think, sort of too many pitches have been made for these, or too many naive pitches have been made for, flat as the silver bullet to everything. Of course, we all know about the ball.
Oh, I just want to have an example, Markus.
Yeah, and I'm happy to give them to you, okay. But at the same time, I would like to tell you, why this is an example which only holds under certain conditions, right? So we of course know about the ball, like, relatively flat, essentially. at least according to what Gabe Newell says, hardly any mid-level managers, he is the ultimately legally responsible person. It would almost be an authoritative structure, which is one which we, sort of refer to when there's only one head or boss and, sort of all the others essentially equals beneath him, right? There's other organizations, of course, if you think of the non-for-profit sector, Wikipedia, that tend to be known as relatively flat structures in the following sense, that people have a lot of autonomy to make decisions on their own in a variety of different ways. There's other, of course, organizations in the for-profit sector that have been portrayed many times before, sort of Sun Hydraulics, think about that organization, think about Woods, or think about the Gore. But what the important part is here is that, some of these organizations may exactly work with relatively few, or I should say, many degrees of decision-making power at lower levels within the organization. But the important part is to understand under which conditions they work, right? And for every, I would argue, valve that you see, you will find probably 10 blizzards, okay, that will have a traditional structure which operate differently. And there's a case to be made for that, because hierarchy is a powerful element. And doing with less hierarchy requires you to think through a whole cascade of considerations. And if you don't do that, you will just wind up with a headless and very badly coordinated setup.
What is it about people's psychology, right? You pointed this out about the role of the book, that you're kind of taking a micro approach, right? Saying you kind of take the psychology, how people feel, how people think, very serious about this. What is it about flat organization that kind of appeals to people or makes people kind of, I don't know, enjoy them more, engage more, right? Take on more responsibilities is how you put it in the book. What are kind of, you allude in the book to, like, you point out to different mechanisms. What are these mechanisms? Why are flat organizations so potentially powerful?
So there's a variety of mechanisms, but let me point to what they have in common. The common notion is that we know from a lot of research that's been conducted in the field of organizational psychology over 60 years, that people up to a certain point appreciate autonomy. Or you don't like somebody to micromanage you, right, and tell you when to sharpen your pencil and sort of when to step out for the toilet. You would like to decide these things on your own. So we know from the job performance literature that, of course, this kind of autonomy, how do I structure my workday, is something that almost everybody appreciates. And the interesting question is, sort of how much autonomy can people deal with? But in general, it's this kind of autonomy. And the important part to appreciate is that it's another thing that we obviously know is that different types of people appreciate autonomy differentially, right? So there will be certain types of individuals, let's say conscientious individuals with a high need for achievement, who appreciate autonomy more than people who rank less or lower on that trait, simply because autonomy allows them to excel in their work environment, right? Similarly, there'll be other, traits that actually moderate the baseline effect of autonomy having an impact on your job satisfaction and therefore on your willingness to exert effort. And that's an important part to appreciate, because every type of organization which seeks to do with fewer managers, right, will ultimately have to, at least when we're talking about human agents, and we'll probably talk about other agents at a later point, but when we're talking about human agents, we'll have to delegate parts of these responsibilities to the rest of the workforce. So that actually means that this part of the workforce, which before was potentially only receiving orders, now has to think through activities which relate to typical managerial work. How do I structure work? Who do I assign to what? How should people be rewarded? How do we communicate with one another? And it takes an extra effort to do so, right? This kind of autonomy to not structure only your own sort of workspace, but potentially also structure the workplace for some people around you will cost you time. And where should that energy come from, if not from something which gets unleashed because you're being delegated that decision right? And that's exactly the autonomy effect that almost every organization that does successfully banks on and plays up to an extent that people will be galvanized by that extra autonomy that they get without being challenged too much. You may be aware of the work that Linus Darland and Christopher Eel and Victoria Boss did, and that you can actually give too much autonomy to teams. That's a danger, right? So we need to watch out that we're not giving too much autonomy to these kinds of teams, but that we actually constrain it to a level where this is helping and not hurting teams.
The paper by Linus and Christopher Tone is interesting, right? Because like, yeah, you know, like to what degree are you allowed to pick your own idea? Do you allowed to pick your team? If it's actually both of them, it actually kind of doesn't go well. So you see, like what you're now referring to, like in the book, you refer to these three mismatches, right? You see, like, so where you're pointing out, like, and I really like that you don't sell flatter as a kind of as a drug that works in any case, but you're saying like, look, this is really a remedy that can help you in particular situations, but only under certain circumstances. And so you're very clearly pointing out to scenarios when it's not working, right? So you kind of present flatter as kind of a tool which is supposed to be used very, very carefully in that sense. So you need to know exactly when to deploy it. And I mean, you see, I like this in general. It's a message which is harder to sell, but it's probably the message that everybody needs to hear, right? When do you actually need to deploy this? What are these mismatches, Markus? When does it happen that you kind of use a flat organization or a flatter organization and it doesn't work? Kind of how can you mismatch?
I think it's an important question that you raise, Henning. Thanks for doing so. I think the first one we already touched upon, right? That's the question of what kind of a goal do I have on the back of my mind. And the simple answer here is, if creativity is not a big thing on my mind, if speed to market is not a big thing that's on my mind, if attracting and retaining young people who have a taste for these rather autonomous organizations is not on the back of my mind, no need to even think about this, right? But even if, and that's the important part, even if these things are on the back of my mind, I still need to think about other things that I need to get right. And an important part is the workforce. We also touched upon that already, right? When I do what we just described, when I would like to decrease the distance between the ultimate decision maker in the organization and everyone else, and when in turn I need to widen the span of control for managers, and when in turn managers then have to delegate work to their subordinates, I need to have people who are willing to pick up the tab, okay? And that means I need to have a workforce which is enthusiastic about autonomy to some degree. And of course, this can vary dramatically, right? You will have potentially selected people into your organization, which is 50 years old, who never, ever had the expectation, nor do they have the willingness to, start taking decisions on behalf of the company on their own, right? That's a mismatch. How can you overcome this? Well, in part, you can overcome this by treating these people differently, but in part, you may be waiting for natural exit and natural entry, right? So that's an important thing to keep in mind. You need to be aware of the fact that there are only certain things that you can do with your workforce. And finally, even if you've got a great workforce, even if you've got a great goal, there's also sorts of mistakes that you can make as a manager, because there's the requirement, of course, for you to set the railroads, okay, to create the architecture in which people can work. Now, if we think of all the great work that Carlos Baldwin has done on modularity, I think this is a case in point, to just, help people understand that, of course, when you have loads of different teams autonomously working on things, coordination need, goes up. And, that kind of coordination requirement can be brought down through intelligent design by managers by creating modular structures, for example, where within teams, people will need to speak a lot to one another, but across teams, that kind of coordination requirement is reduced through the nature of the template, if you see what I mean. And yeah. Of course, we'll be talking about leadership, we'll be talking about facilitation instead of ordering and so forth. All these things do matter, but I think the important part is it's the goal, it's the people, and it's the way in which you treat these people which need to come together. And almost every organization that you see that succeeds at doing so will have gotten their homework right in all three domains. And it just, is enough to fail in one domain and probably all your expectations won't materialize.
One of the necessities you point out is really to kind of expose people to the information that they need to kind of make these kind of decisions. And so that this makes total sense to me, right? You see, like if you allocate kind of the decisions to, like, if you delegate decisions so that other people can make it, they obviously need the information that they need to have to make these decisions. Ivan asked a really great question in the chat. what could be done to prevent information overload in a flatter hierarchy organization, right? Because it's one thing to kind of share information, but people might suddenly drown, right? Like you see, like we have all been part of like Slack channels or something like that, and all the information might be in there, but I'm basically drowning in information. So how do I manage that delicate balance that I give people the information to make decisions, but without drowning them in information?
Yeah, I think that's one of the key questions. As a matter of fact, one organization that I work a little bit closer with, which is Mercer Marsh McLennan, they run the global talent trends every year, and we just had a recent look at the data, and people on the employee side complain about far too many meetings. So part of the answer to Ivan, thanks for the great question, is one of the things you certainly want to avoid is that you try to communicate all that type of information in a whole plethora of meetings. So I think it's pretty clear, there's a variety of indications that organizations that try to move towards, these more centralized team-based structures tend to overestimate the power of meetings. But even if you don't waste, and I'm using this word carefully here, but in this particular instance, I think it makes sense. Even if you don't waste people's time with too many meetings, there's still a way in which you can, sort of create an overflow. One of the organizations which I think did fantastically in the past, and I'm not being paid by them, so I'm just, sort of saying this purely from the perspective of an outsider, was Atos, the French corporation, which at some point introduced the zero email policy, and they created an internal wiki. And of course, the approach here again is to create the wiki so that it's easy for people to find the information that's relevant for them. But you're basically out of the loop of receiving this kind of, superfluous information, which you still feel obliged to check. And you instead, the burden of search is being imposed on you. Yes, that burden of search is a little bit of, something that requires an effort from you. But when the wiki is set up nicely, it'll still reduce the risk of you winding up with just far too much information that you don't want to digest. I hope that's
addressing. Yeah, the Atos example really ran home to me. I think the CEO at the time was Thierry Breton, if I recall this correctly, and he pointed out that the average, I can't find it right now, but spent like 20 hours per week on like emails, right? And you see, if you think about like a 35, 40-hour work week, that basically means you're spending half your time on just kind of reading and responding to emails.
It's crazy. Yeah, absolutely.
Who are the right? Oh, I quickly want to Pierre ask a question, which is a very important question here. Not for you, Markus. I'm quickly going to take this. Pierre simply asked the question: what is a dependent? What is an independent variable? Pierre, this is kind of academic jargon. An independent variable is basically the input, and dependent variable is basically the output. So the question would be like, okay, how flat are we? And then the output would be like, how creative are we? Okay, so we basically try to figure out what do we have to do to get the outcome we want. Okay, thank you so much. If we are kind of if we end up falling like into jargon, and I'm the one to blame for this, I try to catch as much as I can, but please don't hesitate to kind of interrupt me via the Q&A. Markus, an enormous a very important part of the book for me was you need to get the right people. I sometimes felt you use a different language, but many people might be familiar with the Jim Collins kind of analogy. You need to get the right people on the bus, right? You need to get the wrong people off the bus, and you need to get the right people in the right seats. Who are the right people for flat organizations? What are kind of characteristic of these people? We've already kind of tapped a little bit onto this, but given how important it is, I would like to kind of dive a little bit deep into it. What are characteristics of people you need to have in the organization?
So again, at the risk of redundancy, right? Neither you nor I are interested in creating flat organizations. We're interested in creating organizations that have a little bit less of the dusty red tape attached to hierarchy, right? So just to reiterate that message. But yeah, I mean, these types of organizations will inevitably bank on people, as I said before, who are willing to exert more effort because some of the managerial work is being dumped onto them, so to speak, simply because managers can't do as much as they did before. And so the one group of people I think here is the group of people that get that literally get excited by that type of autonomy. What do we know? Because we can go back to a lot of research that's been done. So these are conscientious people, these are extrovert people, these are open people, okay? Those would be traits that matter. Proactive people, very importantly, and people who have a high internal locus of control. So, for the others in the room, the important part really here to bear in mind is you have people who thrive on being able to design their workplace and the workplace of the people around them. And that type of energy that is needed, okay, is compensated by the extra motivation that you're getting. And you can measure this, right? I mean, all of these traits that I just mentioned are measurable. And as a matter of fact, we have a diagnostic to do so. So that's number one. But the important part is, of course, that there's a danger that comes with it. And I think that danger is easily underestimated. And, we have a few stories in the book where, I'm very grateful that executives went on record and described these problems, And one of the problems is that people would always want to work on the shiniest projects, right? These kinds of people who I just mentioned, they're driven by being able to self-actualize, sort of do the things that they would love to do the things that actually, are very visible to higher levels. And that obviously leads to cherry picking, where a lot of the more mundane stuff, drops under the table. But somebody needs to pick this up, okay? And who are the kind of people, who are willing to pick this up? Think of the person who is, willing to clean the kitchen, despite the fact that he or she has already done it 4 times this week, and it would be somebody else's turn, but, they're voluntarily doing this. They're voluntarily organizing the whatever, sort of offsite retreat and so forth. Those are people who are extremely trustworthy, right? So trustworthy people are needed to balance that kind of, extra motivation that people perceive and feel, who are ranking high on these traits that I mentioned before. And it makes for that, so this mix actually makes for what would be a powerful workforce, as we've seen from many examples that can deal with that extra burden of taking over part of the managerial work, which is what comes with more delegation, right?
The cherry picking is so interesting to me, Markus. Like I remember the late Jim March, kind of one of the foundational fathers of the field. He always pointed out, like, look, even during the French Revolution, there were plumbers who were kind of taking care of the toilets, right? But you see, if you're a completely flat organization and people kind of opt into this themselves, right? You see, like, one analogy I often think about is soccer, right? You see, like, everybody wants to kind of shoot a goal, but you see, like, defense might be of a less grateful task, so to speak. So you need to actually have people who enjoy kind of doing the defense, right? We have a bunch more questions. Marianne already sent me an email yesterday, and I asked her to kind of jump on the call and to put in the Q&A, and she did. So I want to kind of honor that question. The very first question in the Q&A, in case you want to have a look, in a scale up of around 200 people, which is expected to grow further, how do you combine maturing the organization with keeping the entrepreneurial spirit and the informal culture? How do you manage that, trade-off, that balance, Markus?
This is, I think, the holy grail question that you're asking, right? So, it comes as the first question. I think it's a fantastic question. And, sorry to disappoint you, very often you won't manage, okay? I think, just to my point, you can just Google real quick what happened to Spotify after the IPO when they started to scale. So the great Spotify model, which was hailed as being completely flat, has probably no longer visible. Sort of once the organization grew to larger levels, and this kind of scaling problem is one that every organization faces. So if you take seriously what we just discussed, then an important part, obviously, here is to acknowledge that scale in any type of organization will require a lowering of the density in the network. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that, Marianne, is that you can no longer have everybody talk to everyone. This is simply not feasible, right? The communication costs go up quadratically. And it is just not doable. And if you embrace that, if you appreciate that at some point, you will see that any type of organization that wants to scale will have to rely on nodes in the network, okay, that will serve as coordination nodes, where one person will bring together the information from 2 teams, or a team of people will bring together information from various teams, and where some decisions need to be taken that are taken in a way so that the discussion won't actually stall the speed of the information. So if you embrace that thing in the first place, which I hope you do, then one thing is very clear: some sort of a structure with asymmetric decision rights and with asymmetric information will almost always have to ensue. Now, how steep that structure becomes, how much you bring in people in that decision-making process, how much you still allow people to debate at various levels, to what extent information goes only up, goes only is only channeled top down, and to what extent it goes bottom up. Those are the kinds of things you can influence. So in the book, we're trying to make a pitch for creating structures that have flatter growth, which pay attention to exactly that. Do I have a reasonably active workforce, in the sense that they can and are willing to still carry a lot of the managerial burden? Do I have managers who are willing to act as facilitators and who are willing to act as enablers rather than acting as auditors? And do I have a CEO who is extremely good at designing a template in which these different teams can relatively autonomously from one another work? So, do they have de-escalation mechanisms in place, for example? Do they have work architectures in place that allow for autonomous growth? So those are the kinds of things to bear in mind. But inevitably, right, no matter what you do, you will see the emergence of some type of a hierarchy. But the variation is huge. Let me just give you an example, right? When we look at the video games industry, as we've just recently done, one of my PhD students, Katrin Heiss, and a colleague here, Steffen Keck, if you take a look at the variance of these hierarchies in these organizations, it's significant. So for a 2,500 person organization, you would roughly have 7 layers of a hierarchy. That corresponds roughly to a span of control of 3. So each manager, supervises 3 subordinates, and then so forth, cascading. But the variance is huge, right? We see organizations that have as little as 3 layers of a hierarchy. We see those that have, literally up to 10. And I think this is the range within which you can work. And if you want to preserve the spirit that you had before, the kind of very broad plenary team spirit, certainly your goal is not to go up to 10, right? Your goal would be anywhere between 3 and 7, just to give you sort of an order of magnitude. Perhaps that's useful.
One question that Nilanjana asked at 418, which I thought is super insightful, and I had not thought at all about it, is, and it relates very much to what we talked about, the motivation of people. She asked, what does career advancement look like in these flat organizations? Look, this is all great. I want to be promoted, Markus. I want to be promoted. So now you have a flat organization.
Oh, it's so beautiful. I love that question because, it's so true, right? To the extent that we correlate everything, including salary, including perceived status, with our amount of decision-making rights that we hold in the hierarchy, we have a huge problem with career advancement, right? So first of all, we have some problems with career advancement, which we probably shouldn't worry so much about. Why? What we know is that people who very much care about moving up the ladder in a hierarchy are very often narcissistic. So, those people will just select out of organizations. That's a nice byproduct, okay? Just to mention the byproduct. There's actually very good evidence of this. But of course, there's a lot of people who we would love to keep and who would still like to see some type of promotion. What is being, done in these instances, or what I have seen in these instances that's being done, which is very useful, is that lateral moves are being created, okay, which do not necessarily inflate the decision-making structure within the organization, which is exactly what these organizations don't want to do, but which sort of move persons laterally in a way to give them specialist competence, specialist expertise, domains, associated with potentially higher salaries, associated with potentially other compensation packages that they like, without interfering with the decision-making structure of the organization. So typical example would be when you have a 4 or 5 layered IT organization in a large multinational conglomerate, and you would like to bring it down to 3 layers, you will have to think about what to do with the middle managers. Some of those people you will just happily let go, right? Because, they're exactly the ones you felt were hampering the flow of information, were slowing down the organization in the first place. But then there may be others who you would really love to keep, but you can't keep them at the exact same level in the organization as before. So this is exactly where that is being done, right? Kind of lateral move packages are being created that try to compensate for that. And interestingly, it works very well at a certain age. So if you think about the age bracket 50 to 60, we know from science that people start to work less out of extrinsic motivation, right? I mean, mortgages are paid for, kids are off to college, right? There's not so much more that you would like to attain in life, perhaps financially. Yes, maybe you may be saving for retirement. But as a matter of fact, intrinsic motivation becomes more and more important. And this is exactly where you can start to play around with giving people these packages that speak to their intrinsic motivation. And that's what great organizations do.
One of the feedback we got here is that it's a little bit sad that nobody can see each other's questions. So just to show that I'm open for feedback here, I've just kind of changed the setting. I didn't even know that we have this on. So you can now all see each other's questions, and you can also upvote them. So I strongly encourage you to have a short look at the Q&A and upvote them. And I will totally be kind of be democratic here and pay attention to the more upvoted questions. So please kind of have a go at it. Guillaume had asked a question which I thought very interesting. So let's say, look, I read the book. I think a flatter organization is like a good fit for me. I want to go in this direction. Look, where do I start? So in the words of Guillaume, if you were asked by a company to advise them on the organizational design, where do you start? Which question would you clarify? Which levels would you do live interviews, use questionnaire? Like, how do I get going at this, Markus?
Yeah. So it's always helpful, as almost everything, in life, when you have got some decision-making power. So some of the most convincing anecdotes, and I cannot, just tell one anecdote here, was the story of the auto GMD unit at T-Systems, one of the units which I've portrayed in the book, and the VP Georg Redke taking the helmet for a unit of about sort of 1,000 people in his unit. And he faced exactly that question. Well, in theory, I'm in charge, sort of I could start to change that organization now, but how do I exactly start? And if you compare his story to the story of another, sort of CEO of a small, medium-sized organization, Borek, which is an online trader in Germany, and then again, another story that I portray in the book, if you care. What they all do is they try to find some like-minded people around them at a relatively short distance to them, right? So your right-wing person, your wingman, your wingwoman, and then start to experiment around with it. And the interesting thing that they both report, and as a matter of fact, several other people who went on record as well, is once you out yourself at the top that you would like to push these things, but you want to push these things realistically, and you're not making it compulsory, right? So you're not rolling out the big reorganization flag and sort of everybody either sort of buys into this, or they can be sure that they will be fired. But when you turn this into sort of an idea that embark on it if you like, right? Be aware of what comes with it. If you want to be with me in with me on this one, there's work waiting for you. Okay. Then what they usually see is that critical pockets of people emerge who just help them do that stuff. And I remember that figure from Georg Redke quite well. He said, literally, I only had about 30 people who were pulling in the same direction, but it was enough to create the momentum in a 1,000-person organization in order to get the things done. So I guess we're very much talking about catalyst kind of amounts of people who you need, okay? And where should you start? At a point where you can credibly say that there will be changes, at a point where you can credibly say that you won't be punished if you don't, at a point where you can credibly say there's work waiting for you, and then literally wait for that catalyst effect. This seems to be the story that has worked in most of the organizations that we have looked at.
Monica has a question. What would be the best performance management model to move from a traditional to a flat organization?
So now I need to ask a question. Are we talking about compensation here? Performance management?
I'm not sure, Markus. I was not 100% sure. So I thought that would be my guess, in the sense of like, how do you assess performance? You see, like the I was thinking about the Morten Hansen has an HBR where he actually points out that in Apple, the only person who is actually P&L is kind of is the CEO. And so how do you actually, you see, like it becomes very difficult to attribute performance, right? Like to assess individuals. So maybe when you talk in the book about peer assessment, how do we do this in a flat organization? Because suddenly I can't say anymore like, hey, there's a manager who kind of gives grades and then we have a bonus or so.
So the reason why I was asking is because that term, is usually reserved for two different phenomena, right? One would be organizational performance. On this one, obviously, we would measure it against the scope, which we thought we wanted to achieve. So, are we getting more products into the product pipeline? If innovation is the goal, our time to market response times, are they going down? Right? Speed is of the essence. Do we manage to attract more talent? All these kinds of things can be measured, right? But perhaps this is not what Monica meant. If you talk about performance measurement of the individual, right, then there's interesting models at work. And again, this goes back to how much are you willing to delegate? So think of a company such as Smarkets, right? So Smarkets, as a matter of fact, said, you know what, we're going to let employees engage in some of the tasks that are usually reserved to managers. That is to evaluate the performance of their own, of their peers, and also, as a matter of fact, set the salaries. Now, this may sound a little bit crazy in the first instance, right? But this is what they have been doing for quite some time, and very successfully so. So essentially, what happens is there's a certain budget that can be allocated to HR, to salaries and any other type of compensation. And there's a consensus process that's taking place between the peers, and they agree on who is getting how much. Now, where does that work? Okay, that only works, and that's the important part, in environments in which people are number affine. So, they can, as a matter of fact, deal with numbers. That's not always the case. Secondly, in which this kind of transparency is appreciated. There may be environments in which this kind of salary transparency is not at all appreciated. In a betting environment where people work on a commission basis, that's probably, as in the case of Smarkets, easier than it would be in another type of organization. So I guess what I'm trying to say here again is it's the question of what kind of a situation are you in? It goes from the extreme of letting people set their salaries when the conditions are a given, to something which is a little less extreme. This is what, for example, happens inside WL Gore, where there's extensive 360 feedback that also actually enters the salary considerations by managers, but these decisions are still then taken by managers. Two kinds of performance measurements which are very, very similar and reminiscent of what is happening in traditional organizations.
Markus, one popular question, and it's important for me to kind of that you qualify this, because I think this will for many people be like a potential takeaway. We have one question from an anonymous attendee: has middle management outlived its usefulness? You see, like in one way of kind of thinking about, we need to get flatter, we just get rid of middle management, and it's not as simple as that. But maybe kind of there's so much kind of conversation going on around middle management. What's your take on that?
So the answer, I think, clearly is no, right? I mean, there will be organizations of a certain scale that will not be able to do with just, two layers of decision-making. That simply won't be feasible. So if we define middle management as everything, okay, and this would be the definition that I choose here, between the layer of the top executives, so the TMTs, and those people actually doing the groundwork with no decision rights that extend to other people, yes, there will be, okay? There'll be fewer, right? As a matter of fact, if you look at the studies by Rajan and Wolf, in the 1980s, 1990s, they already show that number is going down. If you look at the latest work by Piyush Gulati, Panish Puranam, looking at managerial intensity is going down. So the number of these layers is going down. But it's not going down to zero for the reasons which we discussed before. I think what is really important to appreciate here is that if you recall, and perhaps and trying to sort of help with some sort of a summary on this one here, if you think about traditional hierarchies, they all start from the premise that most information sits at the top, that people work for money, and that what managers do is they give orders and they check on results. And the minute you move to organizations of the modern type, where great information sits everywhere in the organization, the apex agent, so the CEO, doesn't necessarily have most of the information, okay? information not only goes top down, but also bottom up. Everything starts to change, which is why the traditional kind of Prussian Frederick II hierarchical systems with a fixed spans of control are no longer en vogue. That's why we're moving away. But how far we can move away exactly depends on the specific workforce environment, way which I can treat people, and so forth, what we just discussed before. But I'm pretty much sure that in any organization of a decent size, and I would say that starts at about 200, okay, other than in extreme instances, such as in the case of the Finnish company Reactor or others, there will be mid layers. And that's almost inevitably the case, yeah.
Marcus, there's one question from Jose, and it's motivated by like an interview with Marissa Mayer, the former CEO of Yahoo, that she was kind of used to work like 120-hour weeks when she was CEO. I'll never know how people do this, but anyway, let's kind of take this for granted. That she was basically like working all the time, and I wonder to what degree that is kind of an indicator of like a failure to build like an organization which is flatter in that sense. You see, where she's not delegating enough. Would you link the two? And like, are there? I would like to make the question a little bit broader almost. Are there indicators where you would say like that's a sign that I as an organization or the organization in which I work needs to be flatter? What are symptoms you would pay attention to, kind of where you would come to the diagnosis to say like, look, you need to be flatter than you are right now?
Yeah. So let me try and sort of go back to the first part of the question, the 120-hour work week, which sounds, as you say, and I would agree, terrible to me, even though I like my job. We have no hard data on correlating sort of work hours to inefficiency of managerial work. That I can't help you with. I would have a gut feeling like everyone else, but nothing that's based on evidence. I think what is very clear, and that is what people report, is that unless they change their style of management, when they widen the span of control, which is what one of the consequences of flattening is, I have more subordinates who directly report to me, then for the same amount of sort of managerial work, for the new amount of managerial work, they need the proportional time. And that is definitely an indication that things are going wrong, right? So if you had, let's say, 2 subordinates before and you blocked a day for them during the week, and now you have 4 and you block 2 days, you're doing something wrong, because it basically means that you haven't delegated enough. So that, I think, that we can clearly say, yeah. You extrapolate this, and at some point your agenda is going to be packed just by meeting your direct subordinates. You don't get anything else done. Okay, so that's very obvious. Now, as to your second question, what are indications that I should be, thinking about this different type of structure? I think you made a very important point, Henning, and thanks also for highlighting this to the listeners. Again, flattening is not a goal in itself. It is the kind of variable that we play around with, the kind of lever that we play around with to achieve certain goals. It is underperformance under these goals that raises the question as to whether we should try out using structure, become better at achieving these goals. When I see that my innovation pipeline, as in the case of some of the large German pharmaceutical companies, is drying out, okay. When I see that my response times, sort of to market are too long, when I see that I'm no longer being the first go-to employer for young talent, that's when I start to seriously think about playing around with that set screw to help my organization attain these goals better. I think this is the way to.
Marcus, I see we are having like some very kind of prominent and some still emerging kind of organizational design scholars on the call, and they of course teasing you with like questions that are natural for like almost more like a scientific seminar. And so one of the questions that comes up here is the work by Frédéric Laloux on the book Reinventing Organizations. You refer to it in the book about these teal organizations, I think it is pronounced. Can you relate the idea of what is a teal organization, and can you relate it to your ideas here on flatter organizations?
So first of all, I think you would have to ask Frederic Laloux, right? Really what a teal organization is. I'm neither his friend nor have I ever met him in person. So what I can tell you is what I've read in his book. My reading of it, and this comes with this disclaimer that my reading may be wrong or at least insufficient, is that teal very much corresponds to a state of organizational design where self-organization is at a maximum. Okay, self-organization is at a maximum and self-actualization, so people doing what they would like to do, is at a maximum. And I think as almost all of these concepts who put this kind of state of affairs on a throne as a desirable goal, they face the legitimate question of, well, how do we still leverage the benefits of these people being in an organization? How do we achieve coordination? How do we achieve collaboration if all we really care about is that everyone can do what he or she wants to do, and everybody can autonomously decide on their own as to what it is that they do with their resources. It is this kind of fundamental problem that many of the approaches that I think push towards these extreme flat setups suffer from. And so my response to this would be, again, there may be boundary conditions where this can work. Okay, you have a fantastic composition of the workforce. Everything is perfectly modular, and these things can be brought together, and there hardly is any coordination effort, and you name it, right? And then this kind of thing may work. And for most organizations, this may just remain a dream. That's my personal view on this. Yeah, it's not realistic for I believe many types of organizations. But again, this is my disclaimer. It's my reading of it, and I'm not the author of that book.
Markus, one thing you actually you engage with in the book, and I really liked it, is you're engaging quite a bit with conflict, right? So organizations are like full of conflict. Yeah. Conflict might actually emerge, maybe more, maybe less, when the organization becomes flatter. How can you resolve this kind of conflict? And this anchored in a few kind of the questions we got, like, what are the skills that managers need to have in kind of flat organizations? And from my reading of the book, like, managing conflict is one of those. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about, like, okay, how do these conflicts emerge? In particular, what can managers then do to resolve this conflict?
So as with everything when it comes to delegation, right, I can also think about delegating conflict resolution. So the traditional role of the manager, who essentially engages in what Oliver, Alexei, Panish, and I a long time ago called the 4+1 fundamental problems: task division, what needs to be done, task allocation, who does what, reward systems, who gets how much, information exchange, who needs to know what and how do they get the information, and exception management, which is conflict. How do we resolve unforeseen situations when they occur? Can either be done or carried out by a manager, or they can actually be delegated to the peers. Now, if you think about many of the systems that have come up, there were different attempts in delegating decision-making power for conflict resolution. So in the holacratic system, if I'm informed correctly, right, you would have a facilitator who just keeps discussing, issues that, that people have with certain potential decisions to be made forever. And the problem there apparently very often is reportedly that, these decisions take too long, and ultimately nobody can, call the shots, right? Apart from what is called the team lead, which is essentially the manager, but who probably wouldn't want to do this because this, would call into question the entire reason for why you have that circle in the first place. So I think more promising ways of delegating conflict resolution are systems that either speak to voting. You have rights that you allocate to people, and you describe also the algorithm by which they can achieve consensus. So that's the typical voting kind of story. Voting is actually applicable only if it's very clear on what people need to vote, but then it's a very powerful, very fast, very effective means of doing things. At the other end is arbitration, okay? Arbitration by peers. This is what, for example, Buurzorg as a healthcare organization in the Netherlands does. The great advantage there, applicable to every type of conflict, everything can be arbitrated essentially, right? If you have civilized people, but it takes a long time. And then there are things in the middle, which I think, Helge Klapper, Linus Dahlander, I myself, Shoban O'Mahony, also try to suggest those are these notions of managing bilateral authority. So reduced managerial authority, which is only speaking to the case in question, which is not sanctioning people, which is therefore taken away many of these concerns that employees have when they're being exposed to the superior power of a manager in order to resolve these kinds of conflict situations.
Markus, it's 5 p.m. If I don't step on time, I lose my German passport. This is the book, Get Better at Flutter. It's dense, but it's fantastic. So give it a read. I've posted the website. Also, for the next webinar, we have Zeke Hernandez from the Wharton School at the University of Philadelphia. He has written a fantastic book, The Truth About Immigration. And if you don't think of yourself as an immigrant, but you think of yourself as an expert or who lives in a different country, you are probably an immigrant. And the book is great. It gives you a lot of factual information about immigration, how to think about it. Otherwise, if you want to kind of, so I posted the link in the chat so you can register right now if you want to. Otherwise, I will also announce these webinars on LinkedIn. There are 400,000 thought leaders on LinkedIn, but only one Henning Pizunkar. So you can also follow me there. Otherwise, please take care of yourself. And if you can, take care of somebody else. On that very note, Markus, thank you so much. Congratulations on a fantastic book and all the best to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Henning, so much for hosting me. And thanks everyone for listening for an entire hour. I know that you have a lot of other things to do. Thank you.
Bye.